What's going on, creators? Today on Sawdust and Wanderlust, we're making one of these. But I made two of these for probably less than $100, which is awesome because whenever I think of live edge, river, anything, I always think it's stupid expensive, but two of these were made for under $100, so let's build them. Now to get this project started, what I did is I drew what I think a river looks like down the middle, a couple of swoopy lines with a little back and forth action. And the piece of wood I'm doing it on is a piece of persimmons that I bought for like $24 like a year ago. It's just been sitting around collecting dust, so it's awesome to be able to break it out and do something cool with it. So the two pieces that I used, was under $25. Next step is to route out the river. I'm using my plunge router and taking it about 1/4 inch deep, and that's going to be kind of the happy medium between not using too much epoxy and not having to worry about going past the epoxy once I'm surfacing the top. Then I take the router and I plunge it as deep as possible on both ends, flip it over, do the same, and use a chisel to clear it up. Just be careful to tear out. After a quick shop shower, I get to taping up, and this could be one of the most crucial steps in the entire process. You really want to tape it up super good. Any seams that you see, any cracks in the wood, any knots, any holes, if you think it's probably not going to leak, it will, so just put more tape on. The epoxy I'm using in this project is ProMarine Tabletop Clear Epoxy. It's like $55 or $60 for a gallon kit of it, and you're not even going to use like 1/10 of it for this project. They've got a lot of great instructions on how to use it, but basically what I do is you pour even amounts. I like to pour them side by side in a clear cup so you can see exactly what you got. You want to pour the hardener in first and then mix in the epoxy to that, and then stir it for 3 minutes, and then switch it into another cup and stir it for another 3 minutes, and then you can add your pigments in. And I don't have any sort of measuring for this. I just kind of toss it in, stir it around, and see how it looks. For pouring the epoxy, I also don't have a true process for that. This is really where your artistic creativity and freedom kind of takes over, and you get to goof off and mix and stir, and it usually never ends up turning out the way that it looks when you first pour it. The epoxy moves and settles and whatever, but it usually ends up pretty cool. To pop the bubbles, what I do is I use a propane torch and turn it on like a medium-low heat and just kind of brush it over the surface of the epoxy. I don't leave it over any parts too long because I don't want to burn the epoxy. And then I let it set overnight. This stuff cures in like 12 hours, I think. I start taking the tape off, and if any of the tape seems to be a little persistent, you can use a chisel real lightly and kind of scrape some of it off. Now, I have a ton of silicone molds that I use to make jewelry and just cool stuff. So what I like to do is keep some of that on hand whenever I'm doing a pour kind of to this size, because I don't measure out exactly what I'm doing. I just kind of eye it and usually leave a little room for extra so that I can pour the excess into the silicone molds. Before I run this bad boy through the planer, I noticed that there's a high spot on the underside. So I just take some 60 grit sandpaper and try to take that down a little bit before I pass it through. And then I measure the thickness of the board and set the planer to just above that, and then run it through for a few passes with really just taking very little off at a time. And then I take some 150 grit sandpaper and hit over everything, the top and the bottom. And you don't really have to go over the top with the sanding process because you're going to be pouring another layer of epoxy over top, which is going to fill any scratches or any blemishes on the surface. And then I use a steel wire brush to clean up the edges of the live edge, and that does a perfectly fine job. And then it's kind of just back to the same steps that we took earlier to make the epoxy for the pour. For the surface coat layer of epoxy, I just basically pour some epoxy on the top and use a silicone squeegee to kind of spread it over the whole thing. And as I'm spreading it over the edges, I use a paintbrush and basically paint the epoxy onto the live edge. Thanks for watching the video, everybody. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. More importantly, I hope you get out there and make something. Till next time. That's all over the camera.